We now move on to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We start with the causes of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It all comes down to the fact that the Soviet Union was moving missiles onto Cuba so that they would have the ability to strike at all of the major US cities. This led to the fact that the Americans were really suspicious of what was going on in Cuba, so they were sending over spy planes, and on the 14th of October 1962, a U-2 spy plane took really clear pictures showing the constructions of Soviet missiles in Cuba. We now move on to the key events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. From when President Kennedy first saw the photographs, the next 13 days see the whole crisis play out. Kennedy is faced with a whole range of different options, some which almost certainly would lead to nuclear war. Some would make him look incredibly weak to the American officials and American military, and so he was really unsure as to what he was going to do. In the end, he decided upon a blockade of Cuba. He would use the US military and the US Navy to ensure that no further Soviet ships could deliver material to Cuba. On October the 22nd, he made a speech to the entire US nation. He went on the TV and announced his plan to the United States. 2 days after Kennedy made his address to the US public, 18 Soviet ships turned around as they were approaching Cuba to avoid a confrontation with the blockade. Kennedy took this as a positive sign and so demanded the removal of all missiles, and he said that any failure to do so would lead to a US invasion of Cuba. The next few days saw Khrushchev send 2 separate letters to Kennedy. The first one offering to remove the missiles if the blockade was stopped and the Americans promised to not invade Cuba. The following day, another letter came through with a much tougher narrative, basically asking that the US also would need to remove its missiles from Turkey. On the same day, a U-2 spy plane from the Americans was shot down over Cuba by the Soviet missiles. At this point, we were very close to a nuclear war. On the 28th of October, President Kennedy decides to listen to the advice of his brother, Robert, and agrees to the terms of the first letter. And he also agrees to the fact that the US will remove the missiles from Turkey, but at a much later date, and it will not be well publicized, so that the Americans can, and Kennedy in particular, can save face in front of the American public. Moving on to the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are 3 main things. This led to an increased rivalry between Russia and America, as it seemed that Kennedy had won the war of words and that Khrushchev looked a little bit weaker. The Chinese communist leader Mao Zedong took the opportunity to criticize Khrushchev, and eventually it led to the fact that Khrushchev was removed as leader of the Soviet Union in 1964. As well as this, a hotline was set up, the famous red phone that linked the White House in Washington and the Kremlin in Moscow, so that they could instantly speak to each other and not have to worry about sending letters between ambassadors and intermediaries. Finally, over the next few years, more treaties were signed to hopefully improve the relations between America and Russia. This would involve limiting the amount of testing that they could do of nuclear weapons and hopefully reducing the proliferation of weapons of this type. This all helped to lead into the period of détente that would happen in the late 60s and 1970s.